I'm Dr. David Clark. I lecture in theology at the University of Roehampton in southwest London. The title of this podcast is Theology and Identity. The central theme of the Hebrew Scriptures is this: God has a purpose for humanity, and this is to bring restorative, reconciling blessing to all the nations of the earth through the people of Israel. In the course of this podcast, we've looked at different biblical characters, noting how some good people like Abraham and David understood this vision and how they worked with God to bring it about. We've also seen how other failed leaders like Samson, Saul, and Solomon lost sight of God's purposes, and in the midst of their selfish pursuits, they actually hindered God more than helping him. This dynamic raises an important question about the theology of the Hebrew authors. Does God need the cooperation of his people in order to accomplish his purposes? Or does Yahweh get his way with or without the cooperation of men? If we read through the Old Testament using the lens of narrative theology, the answer is clear. God's plan to bring blessing to all the nations of the earth through the people of Israel absolutely requires their active and intentional collaboration. We remember that Israel is called to be an example to the world. Yahweh's strategy is that when Israel becomes a model people, they will draw all nations to the worship of Israel's God. When the peoples of the earth see Israel's commitment, their purity, their righteousness, their justice, their care for the poor, their prosperity, then they will come to Jerusalem and say, "Teach us about your God, for we also want to worship him." God wants to make Israel a special nation. God needs Israel to be a special nation, but he can't force his people to love him and follow his ways. That's something they have to choose for themselves. So as we read through the Old Testament text, a question that arises is this: what happens with the accomplishment of Yahweh's purposes when the people of Israel don't follow him? What happens when a guy like Solomon worships other gods and sacrifices his own children? Is this an example for the nations to follow? Is this the kind of nation that is going to thrive and prosper and draw others to worship the one true God? Of course it isn't. And this really is the underlying tension that we experience as we read through the Old Testament. In order for Yahweh's plan for the nations to succeed, he needs a faithful people. But when no one among the people of Israel is faithful, where can God turn? As I read through the Old Testament, I discern an amazing amount of adaptability and resourcefulness on display. God has a plan A, but if that doesn't work out, he has a plan B. And if that doesn't work out, he develops a plan C. This may seem to suggest that Yahweh isn't in total control of what's happening in Israel. And that's exactly what the Hebrew authors were trying to communicate. The Old Testament clearly presents people as having free will. And so if God is in partnership with people who have the ability to thwart and disregard his plans and purposes, then he better have a plan B and a plan C, and so on. The picture that emerges from the text is that of an infinitely stubborn, persistent, and resourceful God who one way or another is going to keep his promises. What we saw in our previous episode was that Solomon was God's plan A. He was going to be the messianic, promised son of David, who would build the temple and firmly establish the throne so that the family of David might rule on earth forever. And we remember that this was not just a special blessing for David's family. The promise given to David was the way in which God was going to fulfill the promise that he had made to Abraham. Through the family of David, all nations on earth would receive the blessings of reconciliation and restoration. So once again, in Yahweh's plan A, everything was riding on Solomon. But unfortunately, Solomon became an evil, oppressive, sex-addicted idolater. And so where does Yahweh turn now? In this episode, we're going to see an example of God's plan B in action. In the aftermath of Solomon's disastrous kingship, Yahweh has to develop a new plan. And this involves doing something that he never ever would have wanted to do. He's going to split the kingdom in two. Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, will lose control of the 10 tribes of the north, and a new rival king would emerge to rule over them. So let's look at this in the biblical text. 1 Kings 11 says, "And the Lord was angry with Solomon. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, 'Since this has been your practice, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. Yet for the sake of David your father, I will not do it in your days, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away all the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of David my servant and for the sake of Jerusalem that I have chosen.'" So God is saying to Solomon, because of what you've done, I'm going to split the kingdom in two. After you've died, I'm going to take 10 tribes of the north and hand them over to someone who is now your servant. But for the sake of your father, the tribe of Judah/Benjamin will remain with your son. So we remember Solomon's labor conscription program, where he forced thousands of men from Israel to be laborers in his building projects. One of the main leaders in that program was a guy by the name of Jeroboam, who oversaw the tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim. One day, this Jeroboam was walking on the road, and a crazy prophet named Ahijah comes up to him. Ahijah rips off his own garment and right in front of Jeroboam tears it into 12 pieces. He says to Jeroboam, "Here, take 10 pieces, for these represent the 10 tribes of the north, and you are going to be their king." Ahijah says, "I'm keeping 2 pieces, and these represent Judah and Benjamin, and these will go to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon." And then in 1 Kings 11, God makes a really fascinating promise to Jeroboam. Through Ahijah, he says, "And I will take you, and you shall reign over all that your soul desires, and you shall be king over Israel. And if you will listen to all that I command you, and will walk in my ways, and do what is right in my eyes, by keeping my statutes and my commandments as my servant David did, I will be with you, and will build you a sure house, just as I built for David, and I will give Israel to you." Now, what's really interesting about this passage is that we see here Jeroboam is being given the opportunity to be grafted into the promise made to David. He's not a blood descendant of David, but if he follows the Lord, God will build him a sure house, just like he did for David. Now, that's a pretty amazing promise. So let's again reflect on this. God is now really setting his hopes on Jeroboam. If Jeroboam will honor Yahweh and follow his ways, the whole situation might be redeemable. The kingdom may be divided in two, but eventually Solomon's heirs may come around. If Jeroboam will be faithful, then eventually God will have 2 blessed kingdoms instead of 1. So plan B might not be so bad after all. The story continues in 1 Kings chapter 12. Solomon dies, and Rehoboam his son becomes king. Now, what we have to understand is that the loyalty of the 10 tribes to the king of Judah is always a little bit tenuous. So after Solomon dies, the leaders of the 10 northern tribes want to get a feel for what his son Rehoboam is going to be like. So Jeroboam and the leaders of the 10 tribes come before Rehoboam, and they say to him, "Listen, your father made our yoke very heavy. This labor conscription program and all this work that he forced upon us was really difficult." In 1 Kings 12:4, they said, "Therefore, lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke on us, and we will serve you." And so essentially what the leaders of the 10 tribes are saying is, we're willing to be loyal, we're willing to stay together, but you've got to cancel this labor conscription program. Rehoboam says to the leaders of the 10 tribes, "Give me 3 days to think about this. I'm going to seek some counsel, and then come back and I'll give you my answer." Now, during these 3 days, Rehoboam, Solomon's son, consults with 2 different groups of people. First, he goes to the old men, the wise men who were available as counselors to him. And the old men counsel him, saying, "If you will be a servant to this people today, and serve them, and speak good words to them when you answer them, then they will be your servants forever." So essentially, the old men are counseling him, listen to what they have to say, cancel the conscription program, soften up a little bit, and you're going to win their friendship. But then after Rehoboam has counseled with the old men, he turns to some of his friends, young men with whom he had grown up. And so the young men want Jeroboam to be a hard guy. They want him to show these tribes of Israel that he's tough and that he's going to be even stronger than his father Solomon. And so in 1 Kings 12, starting in verse 10, it says, "And the young men who had grown up with him said to him, 'Thus shall you speak to the people who said to you, Your father made our yoke heavy, but you lighten it for us. Thus you shall say to them, My little finger is thicker than my father's loins. And now, whereas my father laid upon you a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions.'" Now let's dig in a little bit to the counsel that these young men are giving to Rehoboam. Once again, they do not want Rehoboam to appear weak. And so their advice is speak harshly, speak graphically. And this word, "my little finger is thicker than my father's loins," is actually a very, very crude thing to say. We can imagine what he's saying. My little finger, my pinky, is bigger than my father's blank. Now, that's really disrespectful to his dad, obviously, and that's a really, really offensive way to talk. But they want Rehoboam to seem tough. So Rehoboam has to make a choice. Is he going to listen to the old men who have counseled him to be a servant and to accommodate the requests of the leaders of Israel? Or is he going to listen to the young men who want him to be a tough guy? Now, this is one of those instances where God does intervene a bit to cloud the judgment of Rehoboam. God had already said that he was going to tear 10 tribes away from Rehoboam. So this is a place where God is intentionally clouding the judgment of Rehoboam so that his word can be fulfilled. Rehoboam goes with the counsel of the young men. And the answer that he gives greatly offends the 10 tribes of Israel. They say, okay, we're going with Jeroboam. He's going to be our new leader, and we're out of here. The 10 tribes rebel against Rehoboam. They appoint Jeroboam as their new king, and they break away. Jeroboam then establishes a new capital in the city of Shechem. Let's follow a little bit what happens with Jeroboam. We remember that he's received this incredible promise that if he will obey God's commandments, if he will walk in God's ways, he can be part of the promise that was given to David. God has said that he will establish for Jeroboam a sure house. But geographically, Jeroboam has a problem. He and his kingdom are in the north, and the newly built temple is in the south. The newly built temple is in Jerusalem. So Jeroboam is thinking to himself, I may be king over the 10 tribes of Israel, but if the people continually go down to Jerusalem as they're supposed to do 3 times a year, if the people are continually going to Jerusalem and worshiping and offering sacrifices in the temple there, sooner or later, their hearts are going to go back to the king of Judah. So the narrative says, and Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom will turn back to the house of David. If this people go up to offer sacrifices in the temple of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will turn again to their Lord, to Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me and return to Rehoboam, king of Judah. So to address this problem, Jeroboam devises a plan. He sets up in 2 locations calves of gold. One he places in the northern part of his territory in a place called Dan, and the other one he sets up in the southern part of his territory in a place called Bethel. In 1 Kings 12:28 and 29, it says, "So the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold, and he said to the people, 'You have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.' And he commanded the people to worship the calves of gold in Bethel and in Dan." In doing this, Jeroboam sets the kingdom of Israel on a path towards destruction. Over the next 200 years, 18 kings will follow him as rulers over the kingdom of Israel, and of these, not a single one will walk in the ways of God. So there's an incredible power that God places in the hands of men. Jeroboam had the opportunity to establish a godly kingdom, and God was counting on him to do this. But he did the opposite. He established an institutionalized system of idolatry, and in this, he set the northern tribes on this terrible path. So let's reflect on these stories that we've read in the narrative. God had given a word to Solomon that in the days of his son, he would break the kingdom in two, that 10 tribes would be torn away from the family of Solomon, and only the tribe of Judah/Benjamin would remain. We saw that God had spoken a word of prophecy to Jeroboam, saying that I will make you a king, and I will give you blessing, and you will be grafted into the family of David as you lead the 10 tribes of the north. So there is hope. There is the possibility that even when the kingdom is divided in two, Jeroboam can rule righteously in the north, and Rehoboam can rule righteously in the south. But as things unfold, we see God's plan falling apart. Now let's connect all of these things that we're seeing in the narrative with the broader theme of theology and identity. We recall that our endeavor in this podcast is to explore the interaction between the identity of God, his nature and character, and our own identity as humans. Let's first address what these narratives are saying about God. From a literary perspective, the character of Yahweh is here presented as someone who does not exert absolute control over human affairs. He's not presented as being a chess player who moves people as pawns on the board of human history. Rather, time and time again, we see how he has set his hope on individuals and communities and how they let him down. It's clear that God respects human freedom. Even when he might have had the chance to intervene and stop terrible things from happening, he let human choices run their course. He didn't stop Solomon or Jeroboam from moving forward with their horrible sins. And even when their choices hurt him deeply, he did not override their human freedom. We also note that, again, sometimes God is taken by surprise. He never wanted Solomon's life to take the horrible turn that it took. God had said of Solomon, "I will be a father to him, and he will be for me like a son." Yahweh's heart was broken, and his anger was kindled as he watched this beloved son oppress his own people and even sacrifice his own children. If we hold closely to the narrative as literature, we can't say that Yahweh knew that this was going to happen. The idea of God perfectly knowing future events is a theological construct that was developed in the Christian patristic era. At this moment in the Old Testament narrative, there is nothing in these texts that indicate that when God chose Solomon to lead Israel, he knew that Solomon's life would be a train wreck. There is no indication in the texts that when God chose Jeroboam and offered him an amazing promise of blessing, that somehow Yahweh already knew that Jeroboam would turn the entire nation towards idol worship. If God did know what was going to happen with these leaders, difficult questions arise. Do we see the God of Israel as somehow wanting his nation to suffer? Would he really choose a man as king if he knew that that man was going to lead the nation into sin? Would he choose a king that he knew would bring suffering and judgment upon the people? If he knew all these things ahead of time, wouldn't he somehow be responsible for the terrible things that happened? These are all questions that we ask today. But the truth is that the Hebrew Scriptures don't get bogged down too much in these type of issues. The people who wrote the Old Testament did not present Yahweh as a God who perfectly knows the future. Rather, the Scriptures present him as a God who has hopes and dreams for humanity, but he does not have the guarantee that his strategies will work out exactly according to plan. Sometimes the people that he's counting on let him down. And so we see here an element of vulnerability in the life of Yahweh. He is a God who can be surprised, disappointed, let down, hurt. His emotional life is very real. But what we also see in these texts is that he is a God who doesn't give up. When one plan fails, he thinks of another. When one individual or community lets him down, he finds someone else. Yahweh is absolutely, uncompromisingly committed to fulfill the promise that he has made to Abraham. One way or another, through the seed of Abraham, he is going to bless all the nations of the earth. So this is the story of a God who never gives up, who never gives in, who never loses hope, who never abandons his purposes. One way or another, he is going to be true to his word. Now let's think about what these stories tell us about humanity. On the one hand, they do actually show an incredible capacity for evil. When we look at the life of Solomon, we ask, how could someone who started off so good become so evil? People can be really, really bad. Yet, ironically, these stories ultimately espouse a very high view of humanity. The fulfillment of Yahweh's plans for human history are riding on the decisions of women and men. So he must think that there's still some good inside of people. The very fact that Yahweh, the God of Israel, chooses people to be his friends and his partners in the unfolding of his will suggests that he holds humanity in high regard. He wants our friendship. He wants our collaboration. He wants our love. And that will be the final thought for this episode. In our next session, we'll look at the life of ordinary people in ancient Israel. Thus far, we focused very much on the leaders. But what about the common people? Were they any better? Were they more faithful to Yahweh? Come back next time to find out. I'm David Clark. Thank you for listening to this episode of Theology and Identity. I hope that you will join me again.